What you have here is a gold mine. Frosty stood in the tattoo shop, studio, having barreled through the front door as if he anticipated a standing ovation for his presence. Frosty stood there for a moment, possessing a child's disappointment that no one applauded his bold entrance. He looked around at the colorful posters of sword and sorcery scenes, buxom ladies in scant leather, holding swords at the throats of dragons and evil wizards. These images were mixed with an array of heavy metal t-shirts tacked to the walls, silkscreen cyborgs, and flaming glow-in-the-dark skulls. Gold mine. He was proud of himself for saying it. The statement held in his mind was the crowning achievement of the day. Frosty stood straight, shoulders back, his chin out and a smile spread wide. He waited to take a bow in spite of the silence. Edward Gale wasn't impressed with the performance. He stood at a short counter just inside the door into the back room, unboxing a stack of packages received the previous day. One was ointment, the other two an assortment of items from his regular suppliers. He was waiting for a refurbished stencil machine from a parlor in Miami. Among the packages were some vintage fantasy art books he'd add to his slow-growing collection. There was a guy on the north end of town who owned a bookstore in Dallas. He had connections to collectors of all sorts of books, from all sorts of subjects. Every once in a while he'd stumble through the door with a box, a rough selection of rarities and first editions. Often the items were beyond Eddie Gale's budget, and often they were outside his taste. One time Joe had a box filled with vintage adult art books, pulled from his various stashes, to sell to some exclusive collectors in town. Thought I'd stop by and see what you might like. Eddie Gale looked through some of the books. Some were in excellent condition and others contained such raw subject matter that the few who dared publish such things had limited options in printers willing to risk their reputation. From that poor quality, these publications were fragile and extremely rare. Eddie declined. But he knew who in town would scoop that sort of material up. Eddie didn't bother looking up from his work. "Your audience is pleased," Eddie said with sarcasm. Frosty walked to the center of Eddie's little tattoo studio, a haven for social outcasts, and those who were to bear their virtues and vices on their skin for the world to see. Of course, the social outcast stigma was long since gone, where everyone from the local pastor to the drunk in jail had the same kinds of tattoos. Some clients enjoyed retaining the presumption of rebellion a tattoo signified, that they had tattoos at all. It was an artistic rendition of some fantasy or fixation or obsession worthy of permanence. All the while, techniques for removing the ink became more refined. There was more need for that level of dedication to the form of art, more need for meaning and craft, if it can simply be removed. But for what pain or agony one went through to gain the ink, then to remove it. Such was the agony of suffering a trauma and then reliving it as an art form in order to move on, that the stigma was gone, where tattoos were now mainstream, an acceptable form of personal gratification. It was this very fact alone which drove Eddie to use his artistic ambitions, what ambitions they were, what ambitions they could be. His father suggested being a medical artist, doing illustrations of illness and gore, what work a camera could do with less effort. Mother then could brag and say her son was going to medical school, a bold exaggeration, of the kinds she was well practiced in making. Eddie compromised between his vision and the vision his parents had for him. Rather than illustrate the human body, he'd illustrate on the human body. Mother and father were not pleased, but had little choice in the matter. One worked for the joy of the work or worked to make money, and each of these had their necessary benefits and trade-offs. Business should be booming. It was not. Eddie spread the contents of the packages on one glass counter and marked the items off on a checklist. Frosty looked up at his audience. A plastic PVC genie sat on a clear plastic cloud, sitting on a high shelf, overlooking the tattoo chairs. The genie's face was placid and bored, the plump face in opposition to the fact it was solid soulless plastic. There were various wizards standing around a few unicorns. Vixens stood in poses with troll figurines. The narrow glass shelves along the walls of the narrow studio were crowded. There wasn't a place on the walls that was left bare. Stickers of skulls stuck to the walls as layers of color under photographs of the few famous people and infamous people Eddie sold ink to. As mentioned before, fantasy babes and dragons were the standard. Video game iconography fought with slasher movie cinema posters and glam rock album art for attention. Objects of the occult, heavy metal paraphernalia, comic books and reference books on science and medicine. In the back room there were more plastic faces looking down. Only the faces looking down to Frosty with approval mattered. The wizards and fantasy babes and trolls and monsters were his audience. They didn't need to applaud him to show their appreciation. Frosty stood up straight and held his arms out in a bow. I hear their praise. I'll bet. Eddie Gale turned back to his boxes. So that's the first chapter. I'm not going to show the cuts. Maybe if they're amusing or childish enough, then I'll show the cuts. The biggest reason is that, and I find this to be usually the case, that if I have to stumble through a paragraph, and I'm not the best, I'm pretty good at reading, just not reading out loud. But the thing is, if I have to stumble too much on a paragraph, then maybe the paragraph needs to get edited down and rewritten. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons why I started doing this early on. Or the intent behind this was that if I read the story out loud to myself and it didn't sound right, then maybe it wasn't right. Just part of the editing process. Anyway. I'm going to redo that paragraph again. Break the paragraph up. Again. Okay, one more time. And it's just a paragraph. I don't understand it. The last paragraph. One more time. Video game iconography. Video game iconography.